Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Charlie Gardner.
And I'm Clare Farrell.
And we've got lots of recent developments in the world of climate change to talk to you about today. We're going to talk about some recent research that is trying to explain this incredible recent pulse of heat we've had over the last couple of years. We're going to be talking about a research report into the incredible levels of repression of climate activists around the world. And we're going to start with a really scary new concept that started to enter the conversation recently. And this is the idea of a doom loop. So there was an article published in The Conversation in early December by Laurie, Laybourn and James Dyke from Exeter University talking about doom loops. And I know, Claire, you've been talking to Laurie and James. What can you tell us about this terrifying concept?
Laurie's work has been referenced before by Extinction Rebellion, what he worked on with, particularly at Chatham House, around cascade risk. And so, you know, the interrelationship, the interaction between like different elements of risks and how they can compound and self-reinforce and all of that kind of thing. And it is an area that I think has been, it's been somewhat explored by the climate movement, but I don't think it's well understood by most people in society. It's definitely not well understood by people who have enormous power and responsibility to do something about these problems. I'm pretty certain most ministers, for example, don't know anything about compound climate risk or cascade risk or whatever. But really what he's been looking at is this idea, which he's termed, and I don't know whether it's his term or whether it's a sort of universally known thing in that specialist field, but this idea of derailment. So derailment risk is the possibility that bad things are happening, bad things are interacting with each other, making themselves worse, and that at some point, rather than trying to get off fossil fuels, for example, the problems become so difficult that you're constantly dealing with crises rather than being able to do something proactive to move in the direction that you might want to. And so I know that he's doing some work at the moment with some people that I know around narrative and story and thinking about trying to look at this from like a bunch of different perspectives to think about what may help us to understand the nature of this as a challenge. I think for me, one of the things that's really that I've said to him, and that I think is worth putting on the table for discussion, is not whether or not this is a future risk, but whether or not we're already in it. Because when you look at what the response to Putin invading Ukraine and the sort of bun fight that goes on around fossil fuel licensing and shutting down, you know, the import of Russian gas, for example, into Europe, that is a reason supposedly under our previous government to like sign new licenses. So I'm just putting the challenge out there that we may already be in a state of derailment because we're allowing every new crisis, war, challenge, point of challenge to become a valid reason to sort of keep things a bit more as they are, because we're like erring on the side of keeping economic and social stability over and above doing the radical transformation of absolutely everything in society, everywhere, all at once, which is what we've been told we have to do. So yeah, it's a terrifying concept, basically, when you sort of dig into what it really means, and then I think when you reflect on what's happening right now as well.
So I think you're right. I think yeah, we are seeing examples of these feedback loops already. This isn't just a hypothetical future thing. For example, so in their piece, they talk about Donald Trump, who's a climate denier, but whose election can be attributed partially to climate change. So climate change contributed to inflation in the US, particularly food price inflation, and it contributed to a lot of people suffering economic damages. it made it an economic election, and Donald Trump won partially on those grounds. So climate change led to a climate denier being elected and leading to less action on climate change. So it being a feedback loop. Another example, I think, that isn't talked about in these terms, but I think is COVID-19. So COVID-19 was a pandemic that was brought about by destruction of nature, bringing people closer in contact with animals that spread zoonotic diseases. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the entire world was distracted away from climate action and focused on the disease, and that meant that there was less climate change work being done. And we're seeing this all over the world now. I think the real concern is with vulnerable countries that are, of course, all countries are vulnerable to climate change, but in tropical low-income countries, the damages that climate change is causing is a much bigger proportion of their economy, a much bigger proportion of the capital that they have available as countries. And these countries are having to service massive debt. So already loads of their national income is having to go towards servicing debt instead of mitigating and adapting to climate change. Mm-hmm. As climate change worsens their domestic economies, not only is it harder to service their debt, but also you've got all these disasters, fires and floods and loss of agriculture and everything else. And so much attention is going to be increasingly focused on recovering from the last disaster, that there's no money and attention left to focus on preventing the next disaster and mitigating climate change and adapting. So I think it's quite obvious to me that these geopolitical doom loops are already on the way. And when we look beyond geopolitics as well, we see lots of other positive feedback loops where climate change has an impact, and our response to that impact makes climate change worse. For example, in South America recently, in Ecuador and Colombia, and also in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe, they've had massive droughts, and that means the lakes and reservoirs which they generate electricity from aren't producing electricity, so they're having to fire up their coal burners to produce electricity. In 2022, remember, we had those massive droughts all throughout Europe, and the River Rhine was really, really low. There was no ship traffic there, so that sent the traffic onto the roads, causing much more pollution. And also, there was no water to cool the nuclear electricity generation. So again, they fired up the coal-fired power. In this country, people are cutting down trees because they're scared that the trees will come down in storms. So just the fear of climate change is causing us to weaken our carbon sinks and things. So there's all these different examples where we're reacting to climate change in ways that make climate change worse. And it happens at a geopolitical level, but it happens in other levels of our life too. And I think it's a real it's a worry, isn't it? And you're talking about the power of narratives to turn this around. How would we do that?
Well, so I know that what they're looking into, and there's actually a fellowship running at the moment, is like how stories can potentially shape our behaviours or our decision making in like a multitude of different ways. Obviously, people in the climate movement broadly know that you can change the story on something, and then you can change what's possible because you've changed the story on it. And a lot of the work I've been doing in kind of creating networks through like arts and culture space is also thinking about how culture is very much upstream from politics, and what happens in decision making, or what happens in businesses, what happens in the courts, what happens in the world is often very much affected by the stories that are pervasive, that are around us. why do billionaires buy newspapers, right?
Yeah.
So really trying to think creatively with a bunch of people whose speciality it is to weave new stories and tell stories and write narratives, I think is, it is people from the expert space saying, well, look, there's a problem here in that nobody really is taking seriously what's being put out by these think tanks on risk. And, for me personally, I feel like I've been like bang my head against a wall for the last 5-6 years saying to people, it's not about statistical science, it's about risk. It's not about stats, it's about risk. It's about risk, it's about risk, but no one quite seems to ever grasp it in the mainstream, that actually what we're dealing with here is not like, have we got a 50-50 chance of getting to whatever temperature? It's like a risk analysis is a totally different lens to put on it. We've got myths, we've got stories, we've got things, parables, we've got things that help us like navigate the world because we're sort of creatures that understand things by story. And so I just think it's very interesting to see just an official kind of recognition of that in this application of saying, actually, perhaps we need stories rather than more papers and more information and more stats and more experts. We need different stories.
I strongly believe that, and I think the crisis we're in now is testament to the fact that we have communicated this so badly because we've relied on scientists and we've relied on facts and data all this time and not stories. I do wonder though, so you're talking about stories to communicate risk better, for example, but I wonder if also we need to think beyond just how to tell better stories about the negative, but also tell stories about the positive. It's one of the oldest climate memes there is, that old cartoon, what if it's all just nonsense and we make a better world for nothing? All the actions we do need to take on climate change will make things better for everybody, not just because it'll be a cleaner, safer, richer world full of where people have a sense of purpose, but also it will be to address climate change we have to address inequality. That's the other big crisis we don't always talk about in environmental terms. We talk about biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, but they're both underpinned by an inequality crisis, and addressing climate change will make things better for everyone. And I think that's a really powerful story to tell, not as an alternative to telling a better story to understand risk, but as a complement to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that's popped up on my radar quite recently is this huge number. I think it may have been 600 billion, but the costs of climate damages that's been assessed in states, for example.
That was insurance. That was the cost of insurance payouts, was it?
Yeah, from climate damage and climate-induced damage, and understanding that actually, whilst America has elected Donald Trump to be their president, they are going to now, in the coming years, see increasingly like insurers pull out of certain regions. So I know, if your risk of your house burning down is too high in California, they're like, sorry, mate, we're not going to insure that. Say a lot of Florida is going to become like uninsurable, like now-ish. And so, there's this sort of big picture of like, cleaner, healthier, better, more people live. There's this sort of vision of that. I think there's also a real challenge there in the storytelling sort of space to say, also, how are we going to navigate like basically the collapse of the value of people's properties, right? Or like people in the sort of southeast coast of England whose houses are falling in the ocean, people whose properties are devalued because of so much flood risk. It's starting to happen here as well, and so there's a real challenging job to do there, where people are going to start to get hit in very personal ways, and the social impact, the sort of human experience of some of this stuff, I think very much needs like the support of people who can help us to make sense of what's going on and think about ways that we can bring people together to find the way through, rather than allow things to sort of break down and for like relations and understanding to break apart, basically. And I suppose that's not only a storytelling challenge. I think there's also something else there for me about like deliberative politics and why we're advocating for people to sit in rooms and talk to each other face to face and try to get on the same page with some of this stuff, because it's going to become harder, I think, in some ways to understand and make sense of what's taking place.
And interestingly, actually, the example you use of insurance costs and insurance being withdrawn is another example of one of these doom feedback loops. If people's homes were insured, they would have the capital, they would have the personal finance to be able to adapt to the changes. They'd be able to move, but without having that money, they are trapped. They become refugees and lose their agency to plan their own destiny. It's shocking.
Well, and there was a report a little while ago that I think Aviva put out about what's the carbon cost of refitting a house after it's been totally devastated by a storm, flood, whatever. And of course, that's a feedback, because the more you've got to build and reconstruct everything all the time, you're going to be putting so much energy and resource
into... Not just energy, material costs as well.
It's looking pretty intense. So can you lead us into a conversation, Charlie, about this massive acceleration in global heating over the last couple of years? Because we've touched on it before, and the James Hansen's paper and work on aerosols, Leon Simon's concern about how the heating seems to be going faster and faster and faster, but there's some new research.
That's right, yeah. So this was just published in December in the journal Science, like the bigger science journal. As you say, there's been this massive, unexpected pulse in global heating. So we were coming out of an El Nino, and 2023 wasn't expected to be a shatteringly hot year, but it was. It was 0.17 degrees higher than the previous record. It was a massive leap, and it caught a lot of people by surprise. And so this research now has just tried to explain that sudden increase in temperature. And it comes down to basically a big decrease in low elevation clouds, because clouds are reflective. It's albedo, right? So when the light and heat energy comes in, if it hits a cloud, it will reflect back into space. If there's no cloud, it'll go further. It'll hit the ocean or the land, and that energy will be absorbed instead of reflected back. So Earth is really bright. It reflects, but it's getting more dull. It's getting less reflective because there's less cloud. So this is a real problem. Why is there less cloud suddenly over the last 2 years? And one likely culprit is what we discussed in this show last year. It's, as you say, it's aerosols. So aerosols are tiny particles in the air, and they scatter. They scatter light, and they also help formation of clouds. So clouds form around aerosols. In 2020, the International Maritime Organization passed some legislation forcing cleaning up the fuel they use in shipping. So they use the dirtiest, filthiest oil in shipping because it's full of sulfur, and people thought, well, it's not a problem because they're away from people. It doesn't matter if they cause all this pollution. But then in 2020, they cleaned up this pollution, and it led to a big decrease in what they call ship tracks. So you can look, if you look at the map of the oceans, you see all these linear clouds. Clouds aren't random over the oceans. They're in lines over the busiest shipping routes, and because it's all this aerosol pollution. But those ship-created clouds are disappearing because paradoxically we've cleaned up the air pollution. But so we've been talking about this risk of losing aerosols as we decarbonize. It's fantastic because we're not putting greenhouse gases up, but normally when we burn stuff, we're putting two things into the atmosphere at the same time: greenhouse gases and aerosols. And whilst the aerosols are bad, they pollute and they cause lung disease and all sorts, they do provide this masking effect. So they just provide a bit of shade for the planet, really. So we've been talking about, that's been hypothesized for a few years, and the evidence is coming in stronger and stronger and stronger now that this aerosol masking effect is really strong. So there was a couple of other recent pieces of paper as well, pieces of research. One showed that, remember those massive heat blobs they had in the Pacific Northwest in like 2022? There's a hugely hot ocean off Canada and Alaska. Mm-hmm. Well, they've directly led that to cleaning up of industrial pollution in China. In China, they're cleaning up those factories. There's less aerosols over the oceans in the North Pacific, and that created that heating. There's also been a recent piece of modeling research that basically confirms this idea that it was the cleaning up of ship pollution that has led to this decreasing clouds. So this new research does pretty much confirm that this aerosol masking is a real issue. But, and this is worrying too, it adds a second really worrying mechanism to that. And this, the loss of clouds might not just be because of the reduction in aerosols. It might also be because our atmosphere is in layers, right? There's different layers of it. With climate change, it's mixing the layers a bit. It's just diffusing, so that the boundaries between them aren't so strong, and those layers are necessary for cloud formation. And it might just be that heating is messing that up. And if that's the case, then that's another big natural feedback loop, a feedback loop in the planetary climate system that we just haven't really talked about. And that means our climate system is more sensitive to greenhouse gas pollution than we thought it was. So for any given level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, climate change is going to be worse than we thought it was. So it's shocking news. I mean, it's great that we look like we have some answers to why we've had this increase in heating, but they're not easy answers to deal with at all. No.
And I know, I mean, James Hansen was, did that major paper about global warming in the pipeline, and I felt that when that was peer-reviewed, it was a big deal because it was edging closer towards a place where the scientific community were going to have the information that they needed to be able to tackle the conversation about aerosols and what they're doing. And now seeing more recently James being in the international courts with a whole load of climate vulnerable countries in the International Criminal Court to try and find out whether or not you can describe what's taking place as an international kind of crime. Or sort of reading that, like woven into one of his blog posts that also says, and also we think that climate sensitivity is not 3 degrees like the IPCC has been saying, but if you include all of this, it's actually more like 5. And then if you go to like his worst case, kind of, suggesting that there could be even more than that's in the system, it does, like you say, it's not good news, but it feels like progress just to have it like on the table for a proper conversation, because I found it difficult at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion. We were talking about that being a problem, and the response from most of the science community was like, there, dear, what we do know is bad enough, so don't talk about it. And I'm relieved when stuff like this actually gets put on the table properly. It's no good having like these huge problems that are sort of shoved out the way because of a lack of data.
We come to this almost every episode, I think. The scientific community, the traditional approach of the scientific community just isn't well adapted to the speed with which things are changing. If someone presents a new idea or there's a new hypothesis, then you sit quietly and collect lots and lots of data for a long, long time. And then, once you're really, really, really sure, then you can start to speak about it. And obviously that just doesn't fit with the emergency context we're in. An emergency context means that you have to pay attention to things that are even low probability. When things are changing fast, you need to be really on the ball and aware of emerging things rather than being cautious of emerging things. And the scientific community is cautious of emerging things until we have overwhelming evidence. We just cannot wait until we have overwhelming evidence. And this is going to be a real problem moving forward. Presumably at some point, we will start acting seriously on this. And when we do, we'll need to act fast. We can't necessarily be held back by a lack of certainty.
Moving into uncertain times. So finally, Charlie, tell me, you've been reading a new paper about the repression of climate activism globally, and it's got some interesting information about the UK on a leaderboard.
Yeah, interesting word actually. So the newspaper article in The Guardian that covered this research did say the UK leads the world, which I thought was really interesting because lead the world in an awful thing. And I don't know if leading is really the right thing. But yeah, so the UK is one of the worst countries in the world for arresting climate protesters. So this was a report that was published by Oscar Berglund and other researchers at the University of Bristol. And they looked at rates of criminalization and repression of environmental protest and climate protest in 14 countries around the world. When they talk about environmental protest, they were mainly talking about earth defenders, people protecting sites from development, and climate protest is XR type stuff in urban places. And they found that like in every country, it's getting really, really bad, worse and worse. And like, so it's this repression of activism is a real global phenomenon. But they looked at the mechanisms by which it's happening. They found there's 4 broad mechanisms. One is the creation of new laws to make protest illegal, and we've seen that in the UK with the Public Order Act and the Police Crime and Sentencing Act. The second is changes to legal procedures, changes to how things are done in court. So, and we've seen a lot of that in the UK too. So that could include like repurposing existing legislation, like anti-terrorism legislation or organized crime legislation. And so that's happening in the US and Germany and Spain. Governments are using organized crime legislation against activists. But in the UK, what we've seen is changes to the procedures in courts. So defences that were previously permitted are no longer permitted. And we see ridiculous things like activists not being allowed to mention their motivation, not being able to mention climate changing.
Yeah.
The third thing is changes to policing tactics. And that's something we've seen in this country as well. So increases in like preemptive arrests, stopping people even getting to a protest. So we've seen that, people preemptively arrested and thrown in jail from Just Stop Oil. And then the fourth mechanism, which thankfully we don't have in this country, but is very prevalent in low-income countries, is disappearances and extra-legal killings. Quite often, which actually are linked to policing. Often, it's the same people or thugs hired by private businesses. And over the last 10 years or so, over 2,000 environmental defenders have been killed around the world, mainly in places like Brazil and Indonesia and the Philippines and Peru. But all four of these different ways of repressing climate activists are on the increase everywhere. The figure that grabbed headlines in the press in the UK was that the global figure for arrest rates at environmental climate protests is 6%. 6% of all protests result in arrests. But in the UK, it's 17%, so 3 times higher than the global rate. And we're the second highest in the world after Australia. It was quite an interesting figure, I think. Partially, I think it points to us being effective. And in fact, all this increase in repression of activism around the world is occurring because activism is effective. Don't you think? It happens because we are a threat to the status quo. If we weren't making a difference, if we weren't really forcing changes that people don't want to make, I don't think we would see this repression.
It makes me think about also Australia being like number 1, where we're number 2 in this report. It's interesting, isn't it, that Australia also is a place where there is a huge Murdoch influence on their news. There is a huge interest in keeping the fossil fuel industry going as long as possible, not just for their own domestic use, but a lot of export as well. And that we know this is also a place where similar repression tactics, particularly through legal means, through the laws, through the courts, and through the arrest and the imprisonment of activists, that this, is also a place where we know a lot of the context is very much the same. And in terms of the think tanks that have influenced British legislation change, we know that this is a network that spans the world. And I remember watching certainly like young activists in Australia being either put in prison or threatened with prison for doing things that were similar to what was happening here. It sort of feels like it's very clear from watching how similar the tactics are that this is a very organised, kind of concerted global effort.
It's exactly that. It's a globally coordinated design network of think tanks helping put in place repressive legislation around the world. And although that report only highlighted the similarity in arrest rates between Australia and UK, the other thing, as you say, that they do have in common is extraordinary, really extraordinary sentences for peaceful, non-violent acts of civil disobedience or resistance. We have many political prisoners from Just Stop Oil in jail in this country, but we have news on that, don't we? Tell us about that.
There's an appeal coming up, which is the 29th and the 30th of January, which is an appeal against the extreme sentences that have been handed down to a lot of people. I think they're all Just Stop Oil activists and actions that are on the table for discussion, and it's combined sentencing of 41 years or something like that, I think. And basically, because individual people who are in prison, either having been sentenced for in an extreme way, like the Whole Truth 5 being sort of the highest sentences that have been handed down, Roger getting 5 years. There's also, because of somebody appealing their sentencing, there's been a sort of wrapping together of everybody. So it's going to be a joint appeal across quite a large cluster of defendants. And, in essence, there's a lot riding on it, because when things go to appeal in our court system, it's like win or lose, it's do or die. I know some people in the legal profession can be a bit shy about taking things to appeal when the stakes are so high, because if you lose, it's fucking bad, basically. And so there's quite a lot riding on it, I would say, in a way. But what's important is that, Defend Our Juries, the campaign, they're going to be there. So people can look at where to go and how to get involved if they want to go and support outside the court at that time when the decision's being made. For the people who are at the moment imprisoned in this country, it is also worth bearing in mind that, as we were just saying, with the impact of the media, the impact of the think tanks in shaping the strategies that you've just described in terms of how to successfully repress the movement, a lot of the very extreme sentencing did happen in the sort of in the wake of the report that was brought by John Woodcock, Lord Walney, which raised up these kind of media narratives about things like whether or not some climate groups should become prescribed organisations. And obviously, people who are very successful and impactful in their use of non-violence have got nothing in common with terrorist groups who are prescribed organisations who can't fundraise, can't appear on TV, they're basically banned groups. It's just been noted that, just before quite a lot of these extreme sentences were handed down, there was the report which came out, which really, rather than focus on potential violence from the right wing, which we've experienced, last year with, riots and people trying to burn buildings down and stuff, rather than focus on risks to public order and safety and well-being from parts of the landscape that you might say are typically going to use violence, the focus is massively and squarely laid on the shoulders of people who practice non-violence really successfully. And to go out in the media, as he did, then saying, I'm not saying that these groups should be prescribed. I'm not saying that they should be prescribed organisations. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we should consider a version of a prescribed organisation which is different, which we could make a new category for them, so that basically they will be. And, that really affected, I think, the sort of mood, what we call the political weather, or the sort of, the cultural kind of weather that's in the air around the moment when you see a lot of people going through the courts and then, being refused any access to defences, being very restricted in what they can say to a jury, losing their trial, and then, facing these massive sentences. So, I guess it's just watch this space. It's a big appeal, and Defend Our Juries are going to really value the support of the wider movement, I think, in showing up for that.
Well, then let's make sure we're all there.
Yeah, I'll see you there.
Cheers, everyone.